Hi guys, I hope that you're having a nice evening. I'm going to start off this video with a little trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about some pretty heavy topics. I'm going to be talking about the Rwandan 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and I am going to be discussing a lot of things within that might be quite distressing for anybody who has, well, obviously lived through it, or anybody who has suffered traumatic events of a similar nature in the past. I'm going to be discussing a lot of things that include words that YouTube doesn't like, and I probably won't be bleeping those words because, you know, I feel that language carries weight and meaning, and that we should keep that within the video. Yes, and try not to remove the shock factor because it was a very shocking historical event. So tomorrow is Kwibuka 30. So Kwibuka just means remembrance, and it's an event that happens every year starting on the 7th of April. And Kwibuka 30 means the 30th year since the genocide. So each year it goes up. Last year it was Kwibuka 29, and this year it will be Kwibuka 30. This year marks 10 years since I returned to live in Rwanda. So I was a volunteer originally, stayed for a couple of years, left, and then I came back. And this year is 10 years since I came back. And it also made me realize that the first time that I was here, it was Kwibuka 13. So 13 years since the genocide, and now it is 30. And just to say, the official title is The Genocide Against the Tutsi, and that is how, you know, you should write it if you are writing it. But in this video, I am going to just shorten it to the genocide, just because we all know what the official title is, and just for brevity's sake, I will refer to it from now on as the genocide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my memories of the first Kwibuka event that I attended. And then I thought I'd just talk a little bit maybe about how much Rwanda has changed and how much the memorial itself has sort of changed since I first arrived. So I think there are definitely points in history that everybody remembers exactly where they were when it happened. For my parents' generation, I think it was definitely where they were when JFK was assassinated, and where they were when the first man walked on the moon or landed on the moon. For me, I think the really, really big ones, the ones that I remember crystal clear where I was, the death of Lady Diana. I come from a village which is very close to Althorpe, where she's buried. So it felt like quite a, I wouldn't say a personal thing, but it felt like quite a local event, because I was actually in that village at my mum's house when the news was coming in. And I remember very, very clearly seeing that on the news. The second one, obviously, 9/11, the Twin Towers. I was in Hebden Bridge with a friend at the time, and I remember extremely clearly what had happened there. We'd just been out for a walk and come home, and my friend had gone upstairs for a minute to sort of clean up, and I just happened to be standing in front of the television watching it, sort of going, what? what am I looking at here? And then I ran upstairs to get him. And then the third one for me was the 1994 genocide, which actually came before the other two. So Diana, I think, died in 97, and the genocide happened in 94. Again, I was at my mother's house, and I have this very, very clear image. I was 13 years old when it happened, and I have this very, very, very clear memory of standing in front of the television, watching a Rwandan gentleman being interviewed by a BBC reporter, I think it was. I'm pretty sure it was on the BBC because we only had 4 channels in those days, so it was unlikely to be any of the others. 2 of them were the BBC. And he was in a white shirt, and he was standing outside his shop being interviewed, and he was a hairdresser, a barber, and he said that he'd just been inside, you know, cutting somebody's hair when he saw somebody with a machete chasing another man down the street. And he was clearly very distressed by this. He was like, you know, he'd just witnessed that happening. And my entire life, I have remembered that news clip. And I've never been able to find it since. So I have in the past, I've been through sort of news on YouTube, and most things now are available online, but I never saw that footage again. But I'm fairly certain that that is, you know, that was a real footage. That isn't an implanted memory. I remember standing in front of the television watching that and being really shocked at the time. But also in my head, when I think back to that time, the television in my head is a lot cleaner and a lot clearer than it is when you look stuff up on YouTube nowadays. There was a very famous clip in the news by a lady called Christine Shelley, who I think was the State Department spokeswoman at the time for the Clinton administration. And there's this very, very famous clip of her saying that acts of genocide had occurred. But she wouldn't actually say genocide, because if they said the word genocide, then I believe America would have been obliged by international law to intervene. So they were kind of skirting around the topic and trying not to say it so that they didn't have to get involved. And eventually she gets taken down by a British journalist who just says, well, how many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide?
We have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred.
How many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide?
Alan, that's just not a question that I'm in a position to answer.
When you look at that clip now, it looks so dated. It really looks so dated, the early 90s. But in my head, the television coverage at the time was really crystal clear. So I don't know, I think memory is a very strange thing. It's very kind of malleable. It's kind of an interesting one for me because, like I say, I was 13 when it happened, and 13 years later, I first arrived in Rwanda as a sign language researcher. I was with Voluntary Services Overseas, which is sort of the British version of Peace Corps, and I spent 2 years travelling around the country helping the National Union of the Deaf to develop a sign language dictionary. And I've done another video about that. I'll link to that somewhere. You can look at it if you're interested. So yeah, I was 13 years old when it happened. I arrived 13 years later, and now it has been 30 years since it happened. And to me, that is just a bit of a mind-bending thing to consider. So I arrived in 2007, but I arrived towards the end of 2007. So that would have been Kwibuka 13. But I arrived after that because Kwibuka happens from the 7th of April, which is when Habyarimana's plane was shot down and everything began. If you want to know a bit more about how everything began, I did a separate video about the Belgian Peacekeepers Memorial, and within that there is a short rundown of what happened the night of April the 6th going into April the 7th. So if you want to watch that, you can just pop off and watch that. It gives a bit of context. So what happens is that from the 7th of April, you have 1 week called, basically it's National Week of Mourning, when you have a lot of events where people go to the memorial sites and remember what happened. And then that kind of carries on. So the official mourning period is about 3 months, April through to 4th of July, which is Liberation Day, when the country was liberated and the genocide was brought to an end. So my first Kwibuka memorial event was in 2008. It was Kwibuka 14. And some of my fellow VSOs were working at Gisozi. So Gisozi is a suburb of Kigali, and that is where Kigali Genocide Memorial is. It's basically the largest national memorial site. It's the one that most people go to visit when they come to visit Rwanda. The memorial was set up and run by a group called Aegis Trust, who are a non-profit who work to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity and to raise awareness. They also run a lot of Holocaust memorials, and they put out sort of a little call for volunteers amongst VSOs to go and help for the day. And I didn't really know what to expect, but I just said, yeah, I'll volunteer. And I'm just going to talk about what happened that day, what I experienced. And I always used to blog. I've always kept blogs. So I did actually write about this the day that it happened in 2008, and I've still got those memoirs. So I'm drawing from what I wrote then. So when you go to Gisozi now, and you're approaching, it's all tree lined. It's very, very, very well done. If you are visiting Rwanda, do go to Gisozi Memorial, to Kigali Genocide Memorial. It is so well done. You turn up now, you go along this beautiful tree lined entranceway, you go into a reception area. There's a free audio tour if you want it. You watch a short video in the reception area that gives you the background and the history, and then you go into the main centre and you walk through the exhibits. Back then it didn't look anything like it does today, because back then it was there was no reception area. You just walk straight up to it, and just outside was a large pond, because when the mourning period begins on the 7th of April, there's a flame in the middle of the pond, and it was lit often by Kagame or by somebody representing him, and that would then burn for the 100 days up until Liberation Day. And above the main entrance was a balcony. I don't know how many people could fit in there, but it looked like hundreds of people. You could not see the floor for the top of people's heads. There were so many people there who had just walked up the hill to come for the memorial event. And, you know, you have to understand, I was completely fresh off the boat. I had no real concept of what to expect. You know, before I come, I'd been through tons of training. I'd done a few weeks at Harborne Hall, which is where you go when you're a VSO, and they train you and they teach you about what to expect and cultural differences, a little bit of language training. I'd done in-country training, but I'd really only been in country for about 5 months at this point. And I was still very new, fresh. Still learning a lot. And we were sitting up on the top, and my friend, who was another volunteer, who was actually working with Aegis Trust, that was her placement, we were sitting next to each other and we were just chatting. The staff from the memorial were there with us, and we were all just sort of waiting for the event to begin. And just to our left was an embankment. I think it's still there. It goes up to the car park, and they erected a little tent, and there was a choir in there, and they were singing the most beautiful, slow, sad hymn. And so it was a real atmosphere of sort of a weight in the air of expecting something now to happen. And I was in the middle of a sentence just talking to my friend about her placement and how it was going, when all of a sudden this scream went up. Just scream. And I was kind of a bit taken aback, as you would be. And I looked at my friend and I said, "What was that?" And she looked at me and she said, "The grieving is beginning," she said. And she said, "It's going to be like a domino effect." And it was exactly that. Is from the left side of the balcony all the way around to the right, people just began to scream. I never witnessed anything like that before, obviously. And I have some very vivid memories, and I have these vivid memories, I think, because I wrote them down when it happened. That, you know, I wrote it down in my blog afterwards, and I think that's why I have such vivid memories, because when I revisit my blog, these are the ones that are reinforced in my mind. People were just calling out names, and there was one guy who was just sort of, he had this groan, like a oh, so it was like a soldy oh sound, and he was just calling out this guy's name. And they helped to escort him inside, because the memorial that day in the afternoon, we were supposed to open it up so people could come in and they could walk around the memorial. But during the course of this day, we were just bringing people inside. And by the end of the day, there were just mattresses in every room, and there were just people in every room. But the one that really, really sticks in my mind, that I can just see so clearly, is there was a woman standing in the crowd. I mean, she was a young woman. I don't know how old I'd place her. I mean, maybe not even 20, but she was a very slim person. And she was screaming, and it took 5 grown men to carry her into the memorial. My role throughout this as the volunteer, it was an extremely hot day. I mean, the sun was beating down, and back then there was no shade. You know, people were just sitting out there around the pool, around the courtyard, in the blazing sun, men, women, children, small children. And my job was just to walk through the crowds, handing out bottles of water and tissue paper, just tissues because people were crying. And I have to say, there's been maybe a couple of instances since then where I have been in situations where I've just thought, you know, there is nothing I can do to help. You know, there is nothing that I can do to alleviate somebody else's suffering, because there was just so much of it. It was everywhere. And it was too big. It was too big for one person or 5 people or 10 people with bottles of water and tissue to solve, you know. And all you could do was walk around and give water and give tissues and breathe. Remember to breathe. And also it was quite difficult because at the time, back then, it was very, very much more a Francophone country than nowadays. There is a huge amount of English spoken, but then it was pretty much entirely Francophone, and I didn't speak French. So I'd be walking through the building, and like I said, in every room there were mattresses. And our friend at the time, Morley, was, you know, trained in, I think, trauma and to deal with these things, and spoke fluent French. And he was sitting there and kneeling by the side of the beds, and anybody who could speak French was there talking to the victims. And of course I couldn't. All I could do was stand there and observe what was happening. And I remember he was talking to this one elderly woman. She had a cane by the side of the mattress and a head wrap, and she was lying down, and all of a sudden she'd just sit up and she'd reach out as though she was calling to somebody in front of her. And then she'd just lie back down again, and then she'd do it again, and then she'd lie back, and each time sort of a groan of, well, despair. And there was nobody there. So yeah, it's weird. It's not something I actually think about very often anymore, but when I do think about it, and because I wrote it down, and that memory is very fresh still when I want it to be, I can kind of go back there, but it's not something that I think about much anymore. But that particular day, it was a lot. I should probably have said this as well. So every year, more bodies are found. Even today, more bodies are found. And sometimes it's by accident. Sometimes they're, you know, like digging a reservoir, or somebody's building a house and they start to lay the foundations, and oh, there's a grave, usually a mass grave. But sometimes as well now, it's been so many years later that sometimes people just go to the police and they confess and they say, oh, yeah, this happened, and I remember, you know, I saw somebody do it, or I was a part of it, and we buried some people somewhere. And on that particular year, there were 100 bodies that had just been exhumed, and they bring them to the memorial site and then they inter them in the mass graves. If you've ever been to somewhere like Belsen, it's very, very similar to Belsen. They're just slabs of concrete, and underneath that are the mass graves where they've just put everybody. That always used to hit me quite hard, because my great-grandfather fought in the First World War, and then he remained in Ypres in Belgium as a gravedigger with the War Commission to bury the soldiers that they were finding. And it always kind of stuck with me that pretty much every single soldier that they found, from the British, American, Allied troops, got a grave, you know what I mean? Got an individual grave. Like if you go to the war graves in Belgium, in France and Flanders, you see all of the white graves. Even if they didn't know the name of the soldier, but they found parts of them, they got their own individual grave. Whereas I worked very, very briefly on an army barracks near Bergen-Belsen. And so I visited Belsen. And since I visited Auschwitz and other places, but when you see the mass graves, just a slab of concrete, it really kind of, I don't know, it brings it home. It's always been strange to me that some people get their own grave, and then you have atrocities on such a mass scale that everybody's just put into afterwards, because this is something that's really, really changed over the years. Is back then, in the first years that I was here, everything was closed. Not just for the Memorial Week, but pretty much for those 3 months. It was absolutely everything. Nobody played music. Nobody went out to bars. Or I do remember being in a bar at one point later on in the memorial, but every single bar that you went into was either playing a memorial service on the television or was playing Shake Hands with the Devil, which is a documentary about Romeo Dallaire. So I've seen that documentary a lot of times now, mostly with the volume off, unfortunately, because we were usually watching it in whatever venue we were in. But on that particular day, because we got there really, really early and we were there right the way through until the very, very end of the day, I held it together very, very well. I think because I was just partly in shock, and it was partly curiosity to sort of just absorb what was going on around me, because it was so intense, and when you're in an intense situation, your first thought is just to get through it, just keep going. And then at the very end, I kind of lost it a bit, because like I said, there was a pool outside. Now, the flame has been moved. So when they tiled over the pool, they moved it down. They've built this huge amphitheatre just next to the memorial. And there's now a dedicated, what do you call it, like a dedicated torch that they light instead. But back then, the torch was in the middle of the pond, and I just remember it was really strange. It was like screaming and wailing and crying, and then stop. And then it was over. And then everybody got up, and everybody started to file out. And that's the point at which I kind of lost it, because to me it was very, very sad to see the flame representing the dead, and to see the living kind of walking away. You know what I mean? Sort of the backs as they walked off back to being living, and the dead remained. I know that sounds really, you might say that's a bit melodramatic, but that's the kind of symbolism that it's not even symbolism. Symbolism suggests there's some sort of intellectual thought behind that. There wasn't. It was just like a gut kind of, feeling. I had to shed a little tear there. But it was a very, very long day, and it had been very, very, very hot. And none of us had had anything to eat. And so myself and a couple of the other volunteers, we decided to go and try and find something to eat. And we couldn't. Absolutely everywhere was completely closed. And I lived in Kissamenti at the time. If anybody knows Kigali, if you know where Ndoli's used to be, sort of in Kissamenti, opposite Shelando, that's where my first house was. And so we all headed back to Kissamenti, and I remember there was one guy in an upstairs room. So you have these sort of like buildings, multi-story buildings, and on each story there's like loads of different shops and things, everything completely closed, except for this one guy who was right up at the top, and he had a tiny little grill at the back. And he agreed to take us in, and he made us brochettes and gave us beer. And we had our brochettes and a beer, and then we went home. But honestly, he saved our lives that day because we were exhausted, we were tired, and we were hungry. Yeah. And so then I went home, and I was living with somebody at the time, and I let it out. I just had a good cry. So yeah, that was my first experience of Kwibuka Memorial. That was the only one I ever spent at a memorial. Since then, like most foreigners, I spend Memorial Week at home. So the next day, the memorial was holding an event, and I decided to go. Back in those days, everybody working at Gisozi was a survivor. And like I say, this had only been 14 years, about a decade since it had happened, so very, very fresh for a lot of people. How they did that job, I don't know, because all day, every day, they were walking around Gisozi, answering tourist questions and explaining things to people. And I don't know, I think that would have been very, very difficult for a lot of them. One of the guys who was working at the memorial, he was having an evening where he was going to tell his story, and anybody who wanted to could come along. It was mostly foreigners, could go along and listen to his story. And then we watched a short documentary. I think it was the Fergal Keane one. If you haven't read it, if you want a brief introduction, Fergal Keane's Season of Blood is quite a good book. It's very, very short, and Fergal Keane was a reporter who was here during 94, and he was reporting as it was happening. You know what? I've got a list of books. I've got a whole list of books are kind of really good to delve into if you're interested in the 1994 genocide, you want a bit of background. I'll leave the link to my book list below because it's a good place to start. It's not extensive or exhaustive, but it's a good place to start. We listened to the talk, we watched the video, and then he was open to questions, and we could ask him anything that we wanted to ask him. It's a very difficult thing because you're always very aware that people don't always want to relive and talk about things, but sometimes they do. And sometimes people would come up to you in those days and just start telling you what happened to them and what happened to their family. But you couldn't just ask your own questions because it felt very invasive. So what Gisozi had done was created an environment where if you had any questions, you could ask them. And I think that was a really special event. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to read you what I wrote in my blog the day after going to that event. Because it is basically recounting what he said. I'm so appreciative that I did write my blog, because if I hadn't, I think I would have remembered being at Gisozi, and I probably would have remembered somebody talking, but I wouldn't have remembered the details. And I've written them down, so I'm going to recount them. This is a very, very difficult story to listen to. And if you don't want to, don't worry about it. I've put a timestamp below. If you just want to skip over this little bit, you can do that. So I'm just going to start reading. This was my blog the day after that I went to the event. He was about 6 when he first started noticing things. In school, the teacher would ask students to stand up by ethnicity, but he didn't really understand. So when his best friend, a Hutu, stood up, he stood up too. They were on the soccer team together, so he thought that you could choose which team you wanted to be on. The teacher told him to sit down. Some years later, he was walking home with his dad from their shop when some young thugs started throwing rocks at his dad. His dad just ignored it, like it was expected. He couldn't work out why. When the plane went down and the genocide started, they hid in their houses with the lights off. Eventually, the militia broke in and found them. They made his mum and dad kneel and start praying whilst they loaded their guns. They said that if they paid enough money, they would come back in 2 days and not kill them now. This is what they did. They paid and managed to flee to a neighbour's house. They were found again, and the men and women were forced to separate. The women were going to be killed later, once the men were dead. He managed to get some girls' clothes and disguised himself so that he could stay with his mother and sister. They fled to a church. The priest was a member of the militia. He would let the Interahamwe in occasionally, to choose 1 or 2 people to kill outside the church, and to take girls to rape in public places. Whilst there, he learned that his father and brother had been shot, but not in the right place. They had survived for 2 days in the street before they finally died. He said that all of this time in the church, he was thinking that if they came to take his sister, he would go up to the militia and ask them to kill him too. It was such unimaginable horror. Eventually, they managed to escape and fled to the UN Protectorate Zone at the stadium near my house. Just to add a note there, that was Amahoro Stadium. As more refugees arrived, the Red Cross pulled out. He said that people were starving and dying of disease all the time. You got used to talking to someone, then, in the middle of a conversation, they'd literally fall over and die. He said they had fled from their homes originally because they wanted to die with other people, not alone. One of the overriding memories he has is of a pregnant woman who had either been macheted or hit by shrapnel. She had been split open and you could see her womb. She was covered in blood and screaming. After 10 minutes, she finally died. Eventually, the RPF liberated Kigali. His mother suffered mental trauma, but managed to get a job and pay his school fees. His sister is now married. It was a very difficult story to listen to. So, yeah, that was my first ever Kwibuka 15 years ago. I thought I'd just kind of reflect a little bit on what's changed. And a lot has changed. I don't know where to begin, actually. A lot has changed. I mean, the centre of Kigali, for one thing, is unrecognisable today from what it was. I mean, it used to just be mud roads. There used to be big holes everywhere, like man-eating holes. You know, it was like an initiation rite to fall down one of these holes. Especially after a night out in town, you'd be walking home, then bump, you'd be staring up at the sky. And yeah, they've all gone. Everything's paved now, and there are big shiny buildings. I think back then, maybe UTC was the biggest building that we had. I mean, the infrastructure, when you look at Rwanda today, the infrastructure is just, yeah, it's a brand new town. Sometimes it's the little things that you notice that stand out the most. And I remember when I moved back here, I was sitting in my house. Actually, I was probably here, so it's probably about a year after I got back. And I was sitting at my desk and I was just typing on my computer. And I heard a child crying outside on the road, just like a normal child doing normal sort of, you know, as children do. I remember just kind of sitting there and lifting my head and thinking something was odd, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And then it kind of really, really hit me, because when I first moved to Rwanda, you didn't cry. You never cried. Children didn't cry. Adults didn't cry. My colleague told me a story once of she got into the office early in the morning and her Rwandan colleague had her foot had been crushed by a bus. She'd been standing too close to the curb and a bisi had gone over it. And it had really, really damaged her foot, like there was blood and everything. And her colleague was just sitting there in her chair, sort of just like this. And my friend, she said, you know, are you all right? And she said, yeah. She said, doesn't it hurt? And the woman said, yes, it hurts. But my friend was totally confused because she wasn't crying. She said, if that was me, I'd be crying about it. And the Rwandan lady just sat there and she said, no, you don't cry because you always think, however bad it is, something worse could have happened. And that was very, very much the attitude. You know, I saw a child once. I saw a child come head first off a bus, like smacked his knee on the pavement. And I went over to see if he was okay. And maybe he didn't cry because he was so shocked to see a Muzungi standing there. But it was more to it. I mean, you'd have expected a child. He was only a wee thing. He was, how old? I don't know, 6 or 7 maybe. And he was just silent. He just, you know, And you saw this a lot. Even it kind of gets into you because even a few years ago, I did something monumentally stupid. I burnt my hand really badly. It all went horribly wrong. The first place I went to, they put gauze over it, but they didn't put any other dressing. So the gauze got stuck in the burn. So the first thing that I had to do was to have the gauze soaked off. And I ended up in a place called Polyclinique de Plateau, which has moved now, but it was iconic in the centre of town. And I went there, and even though, I'm pretty certain all of the doctors there were Congolese, not Rwandan, I still really worked to hold it in. I spent 4 hours getting this dressing soaked off, and at one point this nurse came in, she just took my head and put it against her chest, and I was there like that for 4 hours, and I wanted to cry. I really wanted to cry by the end of it, but something in me was just thinking that same thing. It's really, really disrespectful to cry. It's such a small, silly thing, but I remember after I got back sitting here and just hearing this child outside crying, like just like kind of having a tantrum cry, and nobody was running over going shh, 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 or nobody like seemed to think that was odd. And I suddenly thought, that's changed, hasn't it? And I don't know, it was like, it's a really strange thing to say, and there might be Rwandans watching going, what are you talking about? But that's the perception that I had of a change, a small change that I noticed. And like I said before now, yes, everything's closed during Memorial Week from like the 7th of April for a week, but the rest of that 3-month mourning period now, it's business as usual. Like when I was first here, there was no music, nobody played music, nobody went out, none of the bars and restaurants were open. I even remember once, it was so silly, I sent my gardener out to get some shears because my garden was a mess, and of course he came back and he said, I can't buy any sharp objects. And I completely hadn't thought about that. It's like, yeah, of course you don't go out and buy sort of a machete or a cook or a pair of shears in the middle of the morning period, but now it's business as usual pretty much. The bars are open, you will hear music, sometimes a bit subdued, not during the Memorial Week so much, but the rest of the time up to July. And it used to be people were told just don't come here during the Memorial period, it's just not a good time to visit. But no, it's pretty much business as usual. So that's a really big change. And I think just to wrap up talking about this subject, but one of the weirdest or most unimaginable changes for me, that actually makes me kind of happy, and I'll explain why in a minute because it's a bit of a strange one. But I've just been involved in filming a series that Saloba has been filming out in the woods in Nyamirambo, or the Forest as it is known, and it is a horror series. It is a Rwandan horror series. Now we film it in French, English and Swahili. We don't film it in Kinyarwanda, but it's dubbed over in Kinyarwanda, and it's hugely popular in Rwanda, hugely popular, like hundreds of thousands of views per episode. And if you told me back in 2008 that I would be involved in a Rwandan horror series, I would have gone, you what? You crazy? And some people might say, oh, well, that's really disrespectful, running around the forest covered in fake blood and axes and things. How can you do that? But to me, that is a sign that things are on track. I feel like I need to explain this quite carefully, but think about it this way, okay? So you have the horrors of the Second World War and the concentration camps and the Holocaust and everything that happened there. And it's now been 30 years since the Rwandan genocide. 30 years after the end of World War II, we had the 60s, the 70s, and that was the golden age of horror films. All the horror films, all the really bad horror films, and iconic horror films that we still look back on today. And so we're having the same thing starting here. And I do know a few Rwandans who really like horror. I really like horror. I bond with people over that kind of thing. Because it's silly. And if you don't like horror, you might not quite understand it, but it's silly. If you can laugh at the things that are terrifying, then you know that they're not a real threat. If people are traumatized by something, they don't laugh at it. And the median age of Rwanda now is about 19 and a half. So there are many, 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 many more people who did not live the genocide than who did now. You know, it's anybody under the age of 30 didn't live it. And that doesn't mean that they don't experience trauma, inherited trauma, intergenerational trauma, behavioural difficulties from the after effects of that. But there's also a whole new generation now. A generation is about every 25 years. It's a whole new generation. They didn't live it. And that is a sign of healing. You know, people can go, oh, it's horribly disrespectful to have horror movies and to do that. But no, it's a sign of normality returning. It's normal to enjoy being frightened when you've never actually been frightened. You know, it's a sign that things are normal and that you've had a fairly normal life. So I think for me, that is the biggest surprise for me, is being involved in the forest. And just, I love it. I love being part of that. But I would never have imagined that I would be, you know what I mean? it's still, I still sort of pinch myself occasionally going, that's a thing now, you know? So yeah, there's a lot has changed now, and it's definitely relaxed a huge amount. And I think people are becoming more expressive now as well, because I think there's been a lot more exposure to international cultures, you know, from UK, US, but China, you know, lots of other influences coming into Rwanda, and young people being young people, and a generation now growing up with the internet and having access to all these ideas and means of communication around the world, and just being normal and getting on with a normal life. When I look back at the beginning of this video, and I remember 2008, and I remember seeing actual trauma and what that was doing to people, and then I look today at running around a forest with fake blood. It's like two different worlds. And it will be interesting going forward to see how that balances, because now you've got older people who are, you know, the government, as every country tends to have older people in government, and they did live it, and they remember it very clearly, and they've built a lot of their policies upon that and making sure it doesn't happen again. And then you've also got a generation of younger people coming up now and growing up going, you know, it's like the way that I talked to my grandfather about the war. It's like, yeah, that was interesting, but, you know, it didn't really affect me. You know, and you've got that now coming up in the new generation, and they want different things, and they want, you know, so it will be very, very interesting to see going forward how that balances. And it's been a pleasure to be a very, very small part of all of that and get to see that transition and how Rwanda has changed and grown over the past 15, 16 years. And it will be really interesting to see how it continues to develop. It's never a dull moment. So anyway, I'm gonna stop now. Yeah.